No genre of film has the propensity to spawn sequel after sequel after sequel as much as the horror genre. Still, some of them absolutely didn't have the right to be as outright good as they ultimately proved to be. And so with that in mind, I'm Ellie with What Culture, here with 10 horror movie sequels that had no right to be this good. Number 10, The Exorcist 3. How many times have we seen a phenomenal original movie spawn multiple dour, dire sequels? Far too many to count. In the case of The Exorcist, that's a legendary piece of horror cinema, or cinema period to be fair, that has been followed by 4 pretty darn dreadful entries in what's now clearly a franchise. Away from the aforementioned 4 stinkers though, and there's a genuine diamond in the rough in the shape of The Exorcist 3. Released in 1990, 17 years after The Exorcist and 13 years after The Exorcist 2 The Heretic, this William Peter Blatty-helmed picture is way better than anyone could have hoped. After the 1973 first film, The Heretic was such a massive disappointment. So by the time The Exorcist 3 rolled around so many years later, expectation was extremely low for this threequel. Moving away from the outright horror associated with the series by this point, this third film takes a rather different approach to its tale by adding in layers of a classic mystery or whodunit affair, as George C. Scott's Lieutenant Kinderman attempts to solve a case that seems to have plentiful ties to the events which troubled Reagan McNeil and Father Karras back in 1973. The Exorcist 3 is just as much a detective thriller as it is a horror movie, and the end result is something truly spectacular. Number 9. Wes Craven's New Nightmare. By 1994, the A Nightmare on Elm Street franchise was believed to finally be dead after a run of 3 pretty dreadful movies in The Dream Master, The Dream Child, and Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. Franchise fatigue had long set in with this series, and the chilling terror of Wes Craven's first Elm Street picture had long been replaced by slapstick humour. Sure, there was always a mischievous dark humour to Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger as far back as the 1984 original outing, but that was massively outweighed by the utter dread Krueger brought to the screen. Truth be told, 91's Final Nightmare was a mercy kill. Having become a shell of its former self, the Elm Street franchise was put out of its misery with that 6th picture. So much so, New Line even held a public funeral for Freddy and the series. What made Krueger special had been lost, the nerve-shredding kills had been replaced by all-out comedy, and Freddy was now in on the joke. So when The Final Nightmare proved not so final and Wes Craven's New Nightmare arrived in '94, interest was at an all-time low. To make the film sound just as gimmicky as its predecessors, the premise of Freddy as a presence in the real world of the franchise's actors looked dreadful on paper. New Nightmare threatened to yet again jump the shark for the Elm Street IP, yet the end result was a welcome return to the terrifying roots of what made this franchise so special in the first place. Number 8. Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. To some, the Friday the 13th franchise should have come to an end after 1984's The Final Chapter. After all, that was the movie that actually did the unthinkable and killed off Jason Voorhees. While the following years A New Beginning would reveal a copycat killer at its core, that being MIFT paramedic Roy Burns of course, 86 went and brought Jason back into the fold. To do so, the now adult Tommy Jarvis heads to Voorhees' grave to check the brute is still dead. Clearly, Tommy didn't take into account the terrible weather that would result in Jason being struck by lightning and reanimated. So why did Part 6 Jason Lives have no right to be as decent as it was? Well, it basically took a giant dump on the previous 2 entries in the franchise, walking back the concept of the series killer being dead, bringing him back in such a bonkers way, and served up a movie that rehashed the tired tropes, as in Jason murdering generic pretty young things just because, that had caused the franchise to become stale. Still, thanks to Tom Matthews' memorable turn as Tommy, a slew of brilliantly gory kills, and some great one-liners, you have a film that's one of the very best, if not the best, outing for this franchise in its 11-picture plus 1 crossover run to date. Number 7. Annabelle Comes Home. The Annabelle of the wider Conjuring franchise is a fascinating figure. Much hyped as being a key part of James Wan's The Conjuring, this terrifying little turd was ultimately a footnote in that picture. So when horror hounds finally got to see more of Annabelle in her own self-titled 2014 movie, anticipation was high to see this creepy doll fully in the spotlight. Unfortunately, this film was a total stinker. Still, maybe Annabelle Creation could do the sinister presence justice, right? Wrong, for that was just as bad, if not worse, than its predecessor. By the time of Annabelle Comes Home in 2019, the bloom was off the rose, and nobody particularly cared about revisiting a character whose interest peaked 6 years prior. For those who did give Comes Home a chance, they were rewarded with a surprisingly good movie that gave audiences the sinister Annabelle in the Warrens' family home. This is what we were teased with back in The Conjuring, and this threequel ticks plentiful terrifying boxes as the titular doll causes chaos for young Judy Warren while her parents are out of town. It's not just Annabelle who shines here, mind, for McKenna Grace's Judy, her babysitter, and the sitter's pal are tormented by other demented apparitions, such as a Coins for Eyes ferryman, a pseudo-werewolf, and a possessed future-predicting TV set. Number 6. Curse of Chucky. When Curse of Chucky was first announced, the vast majority of horror fans rolled their eyes at what was billed as starting from scratch with a standalone tale that ignored everything seen previously in the Child's Play franchise. By this point, not only had Chucky long become an icon of the genre, but audiences had also developed a fondness for Charles Lee Ray's bride Tiffany and their offspring Glenn/Glenda. To hear that all of this was being thrown out of the window as the franchise recalibrated after 5 films, that had many shaking their head at the prospect of starting an entirely new canon for everyone's favourite good guy doll. Gone were the battle-worn stitches and scars of Chucky, and instead a fresh new good guy arrives at the door of Nika and her family. While this doll starts to covertly slice its way through the family home, this is every inch a complete restart for the property. That is, of course, until it's revealed that Curse is both a do-over and a sequel, complete with appearances from franchise favourites Tiffany/Jennifer Tilly and Andy Barclay. In Curse of Chucky, we have a film which exemplifies how to breathe fresh life into a series while still being respectful to what has come before. And for that, writer-director Don Mancini deserves huge credit. Number 5. Halloween 2. Is Rick Rosenthal's Halloween 2 as good as John Carpenter's seminal Halloween? Not quite, but it's not a million miles off. Rather than Halloween 2 not having the right to be as good as it is, it's more a case of this sequel not having the right to be of such a high quality that it's close to equaling the utter masterpiece that Carpenter carved up in 1978. In Halloween, we have a film that stands up, even now 44 years after its release, as one of the greatest, most influential horror pictures in history. Halloween's 1981 follow-up masterfully picks up the baton exactly where its predecessor left off, with Sam Loomis and the Haddonfield police on the hunt for Michael Myers as Laurie Strode is rushed to the hospital. Of course, it doesn't take long for Michael to make his way to Laurie's bedside, and Loomis isn't too far behind either. Rosenthal's movie is the perfect accompaniment to the 78 offering, with the same night approach working wonders. The tension and terrors of Halloween 2 are brilliantly delivered, and there are some stunning kills, most notably Pamela Susan Shoop's Nurse Bailey, as this sequel powers through to its fiery finale. Number 4. Final Destination 5. After 4 previous pictures, the Final Destination franchise returned in 2011 for yet another outing, which was very much presented as the same old of an opening act catastrophe being averted and death then hunting down those who escaped said disaster. For the most part, that's exactly what we got, with all of the regular Final Destination tropes being ticked off across the majority of this 5th entry's 92-minute runtime. Sure, there's nothing particularly wrong with the familiar Final Destination narrative, and it's always guaranteed to have you on the edge of your seat for its fake-outs, but after 5 films, that basic concept can start to feel a smidge stale. That's where Final Destination 5 came through, and came through big, by delivering a twist ending that elevated the movie from forgettable to memorable. That twist ending, of course, is that the final few minutes of Final Destination 5 revealed that this sequel was really a prequel, as showcased by 2 of our survivors getting on the same flight that exploded during the start of the very first Final Destination picture. Number 3. Paranormal Activity 3. By their very nature, sequels tend to operate under a law of diminishing returns. These follow-ups exist because an initial idea proved to be successful, and thus that concept is expanded on and revisited in future films, usually in a way that sees that base kernel of the franchise become less special. With the Paranormal Activity series, the second film very much fit in with the above logic. The original movie was a belter which caught the imagination of horror hounds across the globe and reinvigorated the long stagnant found footage subgenre, and the second Paranormal Activity offering was decent but nowhere near as good as its predecessor. Traditionally, Paranormal Activity 3 would have been worse than Paranormal Activity 2 and would have been followed by more sequels that got progressively worse with each passing entry. Surprisingly, this threequel proved to be a fantastic, harrowing effort, which managed to equal the quality and terror of the 2007 original. Technically, the third Paranormal Activity is actually a prequel, but don't let that get in the way of it being included here in this sequels list. Plot-wise, directors Henry Joost and Rel Shulman spotlight the younger days of sisters Katie and Christy, the focus of Paranormal Activity and Paranormal Activity 2 respectively, and explore their first interactions with the demonic presence that's tormented them in adulthood. The scares, the ominous sense of dread, and the inventive ways of framing this story make for a thoroughly disturbing watch. Number 2. Evil Dead 2. The biggest reason why Evil Dead 2 should be a stinker of a movie on paper is because many view the film to actually be a loose remake of the first Evil Dead picture. For decades, the debate has ravaged on amongst horror hounds as to whether Evil Dead 2 is a sequel or a remake. Even franchise star Bruce Campbell isn't entirely sure on this matter, with him instead labelling the film a requel during a 2016 interview with Bay at the Moon Productions. Given how much of Evil Dead 2 tells a story extremely close to the one seen in The Evil Dead, that alone should have meant that the film wouldn't be all that well received by fans. Added to that, this 1987 offering opted to go in a far more slapstick direction than its chilling, terrifying predecessor. So here you have a sequel that rehashes several pivotal parts of the original movie and that strips away some of the balls-to-the-wall scares in favour of a more comedic approach to its antics. Gloriously, this all comes together to work majestically and truly set the tone for what the greater Evil Dead franchise would become synonymous with. Number 1. Dawn of the Dead. George A. Romero was an utter genius. This is the person who popularised the concept of ghouls and who crafted some of the greatest horror films in history. The reason why Romero's Dawn of the Dead features on a list of movies that didn't have any right to be as good as they are is that the filmmaker somehow managed to top another all-time classic, that being 1968's Night of the Living Dead, with this 78 picture. Night of the Living Dead revolutionised horror and cinema period, and stands as one of the greats of the genre. So by traditional film logic, that initial picture should never be topped by whatever sequels were to follow it. Completely disregarding this logic, Romero somehow went and bettered Night with the mesmerising social commentary charged Dawn a decade later. With the ghouls of Night having now spread across the United States, Dawn of the Dead finds a group of survivors who seek shelter in a shopping mall. It's terrifying, it's humorous, it's satirical, and it's forever engaging across the film's 2-hour runtime. For George A. Romero to follow an iconic movie with an even more iconic sequel, well, that's just absolutely taking the piss in the best possible way. And that concludes our list. If you think we missed any, then do let us know in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap that notification bell. Also head over to Twitter and follow us there, and I can be found across various social medias just by searching Ellie Littlechild. I've been Ellie with What Culture. I hope you have a magical day, and I'll see you real soon.